Well, thank you. It really is a delightful picture that Carol has here, just to give you a sense of how busy the waterfront was. This is the East River looking south from the Brooklyn Bridge. And you can see the piers are just jammed with not only sailing ships, but steamers, steamboats that went, for example, up through Long Island Sound into New England.
What year is this?
This looks like to be
1891.
1891. It looks to be 1891. It says 1891. So this is, in fact, my third book for Johns Hopkins. I did the Grand Central book in 2001, and that was turned into the PBS documentary Grand Central, and that was a great project to be involved in. And so this is my new work for Johns Hopkins. And what I'm doing is I'm looking at the evolution of Manhattan through the focus, through the lens of the waterfront, the use of the waterfront, and how that changed over time. And of course, September 11th, 1609, Henry Hudson sailed up into the upper bay here where we are. And some questions I wanted to look at is geography destiny? And how did the city in the 17th century build a maritime infrastructure? And then the social construction of the waterfront. The waterfront demanded a huge amount of labor, day labor. And for generations, the Irish immigrants supplied that.
So you're in the light.
Supplied that. And then over time, there was a battle, and the battle was, well, all right, who's going to control the waterfront? Is it going to be private interest, or is it going to be public interest? And that battle continues right down to the present day. And then there's lots of themes here, but by the middle of the 19th century, and certainly into the early 20th century, crime ruled the waterfront. And the famous movie On the Waterfront is a good rendition of that. And then the waterfront died. And New York almost died with it. And then, of course, there's been a rebirth. And this rebirth is, if we step out the front door here and we look at the sun setting through the foliage of the Battery Park City, and tens of thousands of people are walking the waterfront, it really is a rebirth. Well, we need to start with a picture of New York in the 19th century in what's called the Atlantic world. A number of seaport communities developed during the colonial period of time, and they're separated from Europe by 3,000 miles of the North Atlantic. And I put a little arrow up there. The prevailing wind in the North Atlantic is westerly. It blows from west to east, and that's part of the story. And it wasn't, New York's dominance was not preordained. Boston, Newport, Philadelphia, Baltimore, to a lesser degree Charleston, they competed to be the major seaport in this Atlantic world. Henry Hudson comes here in 1609. Newport is established in 1639. So it's a major competitor to New York. And really the traffic flows back and forth between Europe, Amsterdam, London, and especially Liverpool. Liverpool plays an enormous part in this story. Well, this is really one of the greatest natural harbors in the world. And this is a British naval map from 1771. And here we have Sandy Hook, and this is the entrance into the harbor. This is the lower bay. And then ships proceed up through the Narrows. And then they enter the upper bay, and we're right here. And this upper bay provides unbelievable shelter from storms, except for Sandy. But it's one of the greatest natural harbors. And there's another important part of the harbor and its physical makeup, and that happens to be, here's this British naval map. This is the East River. This is the original shoreline that Henry Hudson saw. And those numbers there represent the low water, average low water in fathoms, and a fathom is 6 feet. And those are all forts. So at low tide, on the East River shoreline, there was about 24 feet of water. And that's not true, for example, if any of you have ever been to New Haven, 95, and you're looking at the Long Wharf. Well, the Long Wharf was a long wharf because at low tide, there's mud flats in New Haven Harbor. So you needed a long, long pier out so that ships could be in water when at low tide. So it's a great natural harbor. And this, by the way, is also extremely different than Liverpool, and I'll show you that. And then back to this notion, is geography destiny? Obviously, here's New York. Newport's here, Boston. From northern Alabama to Canada stretch the Appalachian Mountains. And they really do separate the seaboard from the Midwest. And they proved a very difficult barrier for settlement and trade to reach out to the Midwest. But in one place, in upstate New York, there's a relatively level passage to the west. And this is the Mohawk River. And then you're up here, if any of you have ever ridden on the New York State Thruway, it's rolling countryside as you move to Buffalo. And it's the only gap on the eastern seaboard. And in the rise of New York, this plays an incredibly important role because this is where the Erie Canal is built. And that gives New York a really decided advantage. And when the New York Central Railroad is going to dominate travel to the Midwest, they used to advertise that their route was the water level route. And I used that on their advertising. So that was an important geographical advantage that New York took advantage of. By the way, Boston couldn't. These are the Hoosnock Mountains there, and they had to build railroad tunnels through them, and it really, New York had an advantage. Well, colonial New York. The Dutch East India Company settles at the lower part of Manhattan Island in 1624, and then the British and the Dutch struggle for almost 50 years of who's going to control New York Harbor, and the British do gain control. And then there are two charters. The Crown gives the City of New York two charters. One is the Dongan Charter in 1686, and this really establishes the city as a separate corporate entity, independent of the colony of New York. And then a charter follows quite a bit later. It's called the Montgomery Charter. And in that charter, they define the boundary of the city. And remember, we're only talking about Manhattan Island. And they extend the boundary 400 feet out from the shoreline. And that creates property. And that property was referred to as water lots. So the city has a 400 feet boundary out in the river, and that the city controls that property. Now, here's the question. In the colonial world, there was no expectation that the government would build an infrastructure. If you owned a property, you had to build a street. You had to empty the waste. That was a private responsibility, not a public responsibility. Well, then how do you build a waterfront infrastructure? You're going to need piers, and you're going to need wharfs if this harbor is going to prosper, if the maritime world is going to prosper. So what the beginning, first of all, the English kings did, but then the city, the Common Council, would grant water lots to wealthy individuals who typically owned property along the water. Now, in exchange for that water lot grant, because the grant was for the underwater land, the grantee had to build a street at his own expense, build a pier out if he decided to build a pier, and then fill in the land, creating made land. And that was then the private property of, in this case, it was Carlisle Pollock, who got a water lot grant along the Hudson in 1799. And in turn for his investment, then he could charge for the use of his piers and wharfs. So this was private enterprise. And you can notice this is a 1776 another British naval map. You'll see that many of the piers have a name associated with them, and that would have been the individual who received the water lot grant. And here this is, so here we are in 1776, and here we are in 1870. We're on the East River. Now by 1870, here's South Street, and the original high water line was Pearl Street. So you can see there was some development here by the Revolutionary War. Here's Pearl Street, Water Street, and this is going to become Front Street, and then South Street is going to be out here in the Hudson River. And in this particular part of the East River, there were a total of 149 water lot grants made, and that created 21 acres of made land. So by the 1870s, the shoreline on the East River, this is what Henry Hudson saw, Pearl Street. Now we're out here on South Street. These particular maps that are this particular color, these are at the New York Public Library, and they were prepared by the Department of Docks, which is formed in 1870. But what they had to do then is they had to go back and do a giant title search to figure out who owned the waterfront. And they made these very detailed maps, as you can see. And then we can continue. These maps go up to both sides of the river, and here's a map of Stuyvesant Cove. So here's 14th Street. Here's 23rd Street. The original shoreline was First Avenue, here. And these were just giant water lots. They granted 4 of them. And the Flack and Nicholas Gouverneur is an old Dutch name here in New York, got a very large grant. And this is where a lot of Stuyvesant Town, Peter Cooper Village sits. And then over on the Hudson River, there was the Moore family. The Moore was the Episcopal Bishop of New York, and he had a son, Clement Seymour, night before Christmas, right? And then he had a son, Benjamin Moore. And they owned a large estate here, a large estate along in Chelsea. And then they got a series of very large water lot grants. So this is the original high water line, and then this is 12th Avenue. So these were very large water lot grants, and so Chelsea, this particular part of Chelsea, is all made land. It was filled in through these water lot grants.
Where did they get all the fill to fill it in?
When they started to, this is the middle of the 19th century. This city is booming. You're building structures, you're building tenements, and if the tenement is 25 by 80, you've got to excavate a cellar, and you need to have somewhere to dump that fill. That was one source. Another source was when the city adopts the grid, in many parts of the city, there was quite a few hills, and they pulled down those hills to level the land, not level it perfectly, and they use that for fill. They use garbage. They use sewage. They used old ships. They buried them to build this made land. And this is then, in effect, another water line. This is a very haunting picture, I think you'll all agree, isn't it? So the Port Authority is going to build the World Trade Center. they have to dig a big hole. And that hole had, I think, 1,200,000 cubic yards of muck and fill. And rather than barge it away, what they did, by this time, the piers here from the Battery up to Chambers Street had been abandoned. They were abandoned, they were derelict, and this was what was called the pierhead line here. And so what the Port Authority did is they simply built cofferdams here, and then they filled, and that created 90 acres, and that's where we are right now. This is Battery Park City. This is going to become Battery Park City. Well, the result of this, over 250 years of water lot grants, is this British Navy map, 1776. And then what I did is I took the digital street map from the New York City Planning Department, and I superimposed them that because this is oriented geographically. And here's 14th Street, and you can see where the shoreline is now. And that includes Stuyvesant Town, Battery Park City, the Freedom Tower and World Trade, the Hudson River Park, the Chelsea Piers. So the end result of this was to create over almost 2,300 acres of made land. And we'll see later, a lot of the property of New York, and now the most valuable property, sits on that made land. And I don't want to get ahead of myself, but then along comes Sandy. Well, what about the ascendancy of this port? Both Newport and New York were occupied during the Revolutionary War, and the occupation devastated New York. The estimates are that they lost half the population, fire destroyed buildings, the British controlled the ships that could come and leave, and the maritime commerce of the city was devastated. But it begins to recover. And here's a picture of a ship that's leaving New York February 22nd, 1784, and it's going to sail to China, and it's going to return with Chinese goods, and it's going to earn 100% profit. So this was a good motivation. So the New York shipping interests, they begin to recover and press forward. And then what happens is in 1817, there are a group of Quaker merchants. Jeremiah Thompson was one of the leading merchants. And what he and his partners decided to do, they owned 4 sailing ships. And they put an advertisement in the Gazette Commercial Advertiser, and they said that their ships would leave on a given day every month, regardless of the weather, and then one of their ships would leave Liverpool on a given day, regardless of the weather. Now, prior to this, ships came and went hither and yon. They waited till they had cargo. There was no reliable, you couldn't come to New York and reliably have a ship leave on a schedule. It just didn't do that. But these were called packet ships because the correspondence, the letters, were in packets. And so they were called packet ships. And this was immediately successful. And there's an historian, Robert Albion, who wrote these wonderful books around the mid-30s. One is Square Riggers on Schedule, who has all of this valuable information that he collected. Now, remember the prevailing wind? The prevailing wind is westerly. Now it's February and you're on the Liverpool waterfront and you're getting on a packet ship and you're going to sail across the North Atlantic in winter. And if you all remember last winter with those multiple nor'easters that came through, it is hard to imagine how tough it was to do this. I think to our modern sensibility, it's very difficult to do it. My students once said, well, what do you mean? And I said, well, look, here's what I want you to do. I want you some February night when it's snowing, I want you to put on as much wool clothing as you have, and you can put a shell over it, because they used to have what was called, they used to impregnate canvas with oil, and those were called oilskins. So it's somewhat equivalent. And then what I want you to do is go out in the backyard for 4 hours because you're standing watch. Then I want you to spray yourself with a hose. Because that's how difficult this was to do. And by the way, I would like you to see the length of these ships, about 100 feet long. And then in the very first voyage, it takes the James Monroe 23 days to sail to Liverpool from New York. However, the Amity, which left Liverpool, sailing into the westerlies, it took the Amity 47 days. So typically it was double the time on the voyage back. And these really were tough men. This was a really dangerous thing to do. Here you see 4 men up in this is the yardarm, and they're standing on a rope, and they're leaning over. They don't have a safety vest on. They're leaning over, and they're gathering the sail. And they're going to tie the sail to this yardarm here because they've got to shorten sail because of the storm. And these were young men. It was extremely dangerous. They were poorly paid. When you signed on to one of these ships, you were on deck for 4 hours, and you're off deck for 4 hours, and you're back on the deck for 4 hours. And many of them were illiterate. I've seen the ship's papers up at the Mystic Seaport, and a lot of X's, and then the officer writes their name. And they drank too much. They fought with one another, especially in the boarding houses and brothels and bars on the East River. And they died young. They died young. Here's 2 examples. This is from Albion. Great Western, January 7th, 1853, while reefing the fore topsail, that would be up here. Emmanuel Amke fell from the yard on deck and was killed instantly. And then Joshua Remick fell overboard and was drowned. It blowing a gale at the time could not save him. He was dead. They didn't stop the ship. They couldn't stop the ship. It would have just been impossible to stop one of these big sailing ships. So if you fell overboard with all your wool clothing on, no safety harness, no life vest, you just die. And the logs are filled with examples of this type of these types of accidents. Well, what this then helps create is what I refer to as New York's waterway empire. So here we have the city. And of course, the Hudson River is navigable all the way to Albany, actually past Albany. And then in Albany, the Erie Canal is going to be constructed, which then connects the city to Buffalo and Lake Erie. And with Lake Erie, the ships can sail to Chicago. The lake's frozen in the wintertime, so did the canal, but they could sail. And that was an important thing for New York to have. Philadelphia couldn't establish that type of a link. Baltimore couldn't, and Boston couldn't. And then more locally, you go up the East River, go through the Hell Gate, and you're into Long Island Sound, and for 90 miles you have a protected body of water, and that takes you to Narragansett Bay, to Newport and Providence, and that was an important inland waterway. And the ships stopped, the steamboats went to the various ports along the Connecticut shoreline, and they actually would go up the Connecticut River to Hartford. And then there are rapids north of Hartford, but what they do is they'd unload, and then they'd load onto other steamboats that would go up to Vermont on the river there. And then right immediately around New York, this city needed tons and tons of food to come here every day to feed a population. There's going to be 1 million people living on this island in 1880. And to feed them, you just had to bring goods to the harbor. And so the harbor was filled with the big sailing ships, but also small sailing vessels that went up the Hudson River, out to Long Island, down to Raritan Bay. And by the way, there were two canals built, one here. This particular canal that connected Kingston to the Pennsylvania coal fields. You're going to need millions and millions of tons of coal here in this city to heat the buildings and to run the furnaces. This was a big manufacturing center, and we forget that in the 19th century. And then I mentioned to you about this all-important route between New York and Liverpool. For the 19th century, almost the entire 19th century, the most valuable thing that this economy produced was cotton. Everything else paled in comparison. Cotton was really king. And Sven Beckett from Harvard wrote a wonderful book called The Empire of Cotton. And you know, I remember in our high school history books, they would have the cotton triangle. So I kind of made you a cotton triangle here. But I made this a dotted line. Because really, you could make an, Albion certainly makes the argument, it was a triangle with only two sides. It was New York to Liverpool, Liverpool to New York, and then New York to the southern ports. And then here, you can see, this is a graph with just total exports and then cotton. And you can see for almost the entire 19th century, it was cotton. You know, I think we like the story of the yeoman farmers who go out to Ohio and grow wheat, which they did do that, but it paled in comparison. And our Industrial Revolution doesn't begin until after the Civil War. And certainly the Southern apologists thought that New York would be opposed to war because New York financed the cotton. It was the New York merchants who had money. They in turn invested that money in the southern plantations. The shipping companies in New York financed the insurance on the cotton bales. They then developed this very elaborate system of international trade with what were called bills of exchange. And you had a functioning international system of trade between New York and Liverpool. And then what this does is, this sets off the second big cotton boom in the South. You know, there was an argument that cotton, the land in the original southern states had been depleted, the yields weren't very high. Well, after the Louisiana Purchase, huge amounts, and the expelling of the Indians, a huge amount of land came open in Louisiana and Mississippi. And it really was a second Middle Passage because the slave owners in the Carolinas, for example, or in Virginia, they sold their slaves. And they sold their slaves to the new plantations in the Deep South. And this is where cotton is king. By the way, you can just see over here, this is a steamboat. I don't know what river it's on, but it's piled with cotton bales. But that ship couldn't go out in the ocean. You know, you had to put the cotton bales on another ship to get it across the North Atlantic. And again, the streets of New York, the waterfront streets, were incredibly crowded. This is a picture looking up toward the Brooklyn Bridge. And this is a four-masted schooner. Here they're unloading cotton bales. This is an East River pier, and you can see it's just open. This is West Street. So we think traffic jams are bad on West Street now. This is...
So the cotton was going from the Deep South to New York.
That's right.
By paddling?
No, they were packet lines that ran from the southern packet ports to New York.
There's steam power?
That comes later.
Okay.
They originally
so
sailing
going
vessels.
By, four-masters.
Right. And they would sail up, and they'd unload the cotton on one pier, they'd truck it to a pier where one of the packet ships was leaving to go to Liverpool. And now, that's not to say that ships didn't leave directly from New Orleans and sail to Liverpool, but often they were owned by New York shipping interest. It was their ships. And then I mentioned Liverpool, and of course, England has an industrial revolution 100 years before we have an industrial revolution, and that industrial revolution involved cotton. And it created an insatiable demand for cotton for the mills in Manchester and Birmingham, and Liverpool is the waterway gateway to Lancashire, that particular part of England. But they have these mudflats in the Mersey River. So you couldn't build piers or wharfs in the Mersey River. So the city of Liverpool built invested in a huge development of docks along the Mersey River. And this is a system of what is called wet basins. So high tide, gates open, ships come into the basin, gates close, tide goes down, and the ships are in the basin, they're being unloaded. And there's a whole system of these, and this was a huge public expense. This is something New York avoided, because New York built its waterfront with private investment. You couldn't do that in Liverpool. So in Liverpool, it was public investment, and that was also true in London. And then a ship that went into the basin paid a fee to, in effect, the Port Authority of Liverpool. I wrote about this in my Wilgus book, and then to even complicate the waterfront more, the railroads arrive. Well, the New York Central has direct access to Manhattan Island. The other railroads are a mile away in New Jersey. And that's not where their passengers, I love New Jersey, it's not where their passengers wanted to be. They wanted to be on Manhattan Island. So what the railroads had to do is they had to compete with the shipping companies for space along the waterfront. And they did. But it was competition, and it even increased the chaos on the waterfront.
What about the freight?
They did the same thing. They loaded the freight on barges and brought it across. Maybe some of you have seen pictures of, they had large barges where they put the freight cars on the barges, and then a tugboat would push that barge from New Jersey to the Hudson River waterfront, and then the barge would then, the railroad cars were pulled off the barge, and there were railroad yards along the Hudson River. Well, there's another piece to this story. There's a human piece to this story, and it's about crime, corruption, Tammany Hall. And again, it's an epic battle between private and public control of the waterfront. I don't know if, do any of you remember the movie with the dead rabbits in it? Gangs of New York. The battle at the beginning, and Daniel Day-Lewis says, "Where's your army?" And out comes the dead rabbits, right? Well, they were a gang, and the gangs terrorized the waterfront. Well, by the Civil War, this system of private control of the waterfront has just broken down. The shipping companies complain they don't want to be shook down to get to a pier. Often there would be 300 ships out in the upper bay waiting for a pier to come vacant on Manhattan or on the Brooklyn waterfront. And I'm going to talk about a technological revolution that's underway, and longer piers need to be built. Well, the private owners don't want to spend that money. So reform occurs. In 1870, the state of New York and the city of New York form the Department of Docks. And this is going to reassert or assert public control of the waterfront. And what the plan is the Department of Docks is going to buy back the private water lots and the shorefront. And they begin to do that in 1870, and in fact, that's what they do. And then they're going to own the piers. They're going to build modern piers, and in many cases, they're going to lease those piers to shipping companies. So this is, in effect, a public takeover of the waterfront in 1870. This is the famous, whoops, I'm going to come back over here. There's George McClellan, the Union general, He demanded a salary of $20,000 a year to be the first superintendent of the Department of Docks, and the governor was paid $10,000. And then they began to buy back the waterfront and rebuild the waterfront. And what they did was they began to construct a bulkhead around southern Manhattan Island, and they eventually built almost 18 miles of that. And here's what they did. They excavated, this is an example of how they built the bulkhead. They did precast concrete. They actually had divers who would go down to the bottom of the Hudson or East River, and then they would tie these precast blocks together, and then the very last couple of 10, 12 feet was granite, and then they backfilled, and then they rebuilt West Street, or they rebuilt South Street. This was a huge undertaking. This would be billions of dollars today to do this. And they had this giant crane, where this crane would be floated to where they were building. You can see it lowering these precast blocks. I was walking on Hudson River Park a couple of weeks ago, and I got my iPhone out, and this is down by where Pier 40 is, and this is the Hudson River Park, and you can see those granite blocks. Mm-hmm. Those are from the work that the Department of Docks did in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s. And it's hard to imagine how Hudson River Park could have worked if it didn't have that bulkhead there. That would have been a very, very expensive thing to do, but the bulkhead was there. Well, there's another revolution afoot. The ships are getting longer, and they're beginning to be steam powered and constructed with iron. There's really a limit to how long you could build a wooden sailing ship. But this is another technological revolution. So for example, in 1840, the Britannia, which is Samuel Cunard's ship, is 222 feet long. That's twice as long as the Black Ball package ships. And there was Edward Collins competed with Cunard, and his Baltic ship was about the same length. So this is a technological revolution. Steam power coming to the world of shipping. And just a note here, Collins competed early on with Cunard, and then Collins has a series of disasters. One of his ships, the Arctic, had a collision off of Newfoundland in the winter, and 318 people died, including Collins' wife and daughter. They were on the ship. And then another one of his ships, Pacific, left Liverpool, and they never heard from it. There was no radio communication. And this was not unusual, especially in the North Atlantic in winter. Ships would just simply disappear, and no trace was ever found of them. And then this continues. This revolution continues. And what's interesting is the British win the fight for control of shipping across the North Atlantic. And capital here in New York moves in other directions into the American Industrial Revolution. And we see the control of the North Atlantic shipping to the British, and then you can see 600 feet, then 800 feet. The Titanic is 900 feet. So you need much longer piers. And private enterprise couldn't build that. So it's the Department of Docks that builds the longer piers and then leases them to the shipping companies like Cunard. And this continues then the evolution of the maritime infrastructure. And then let me give you an example of what the Department of Docks had to do. And this is really quite complicated. This is where, by 1870, this is this is 13th Avenue and some piers in Greenwich Village. Here's Horatio Street, Gonsworth, Bank, West 11th. So here were the piers in the Hudson River, and they were quite small, as you can see. And then this was made land here. These 6 blocks were made land. Well, where is the Mauritania at 900 feet? Where is it going to find a place to dock? East River, too narrow, piers aren't long enough. So the Department of Docks is going to build 800-foot piers along this stretch of the Greenwich Village waterfront. But what they have to do is they have to buy back this block, then they have to tear all the buildings down, and then they have to dredge all the way back to what now will be West Street. And by the way, the private property owners here made out like bandits because they often went to court, and the court set a price for a property. And if you think the Astor family had a fortune early on, when the Astor descendants were paid for the water lots that John Jacob Astor had along the Hudson River, they were wealthier once again. And this was a giant.
Why didn't they just build the piers more out into the water?
Well, by this time, the water is controlled by the federal government. And the federal government wanted to keep the Hudson River and other rivers navigable. And they wouldn't let the city of New York come out farther into the Hudson River because of the federal control of the navigable waterways. So they do all this, and then they sell it. No, I'm sorry, they lease it to White Star, Leland, and Cunard, and revenue is quite substantial, isn't it? You know, here, the Department of Docks made money for 60 years. They spent a lot of money, but the leases, because this was the most valuable waterfront, and certainly in the United States, if not in the world. And so the Department of Docks could charge a great deal, could charge the railroads, could charge the shipping companies for space along the waterfront. And this is in the 1890s. They spent about $6 million. So we could run that number forward, couldn't we? And they did the same thing in Chelsea, because the 800 feet piers, the Titanic's was 1,000 feet long. So the Department of Docks went up. Here's all the more water lots. The Department of Docks bought them. And then they moved West Street inland, excavated, and constructed the Chelsea piers. And the Chelsea piers are still with us today. This is the Chelsea piers here. And the architect of the Chelsea piers, the facade, was Whitney Warren, who was the architect of Grand Central. And this was hailed as a great gateway to Manhattan. So the luxury liners would come across the North Atlantic, they'd tie up at the Chelsea piers, and that was an elegant entry port to the city, just as Grand Central was if you came by train. And this was another huge project that the Department of Docks undertook. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but I mentioned earlier that you needed a workforce to man the docks. And there's this West Greenwich Village and Chelsea, and then here's along the East River. And these were this was the Irish waterfront. The Irish for generations were the predominant people who worked the docks. And they lived in these neighborhoods along the rivers. Here's an example. I'm back over here. This is Ward 4 here. And then this is a Bromley detailed street map from the 1870s. And here they're beginning the Brooklyn Bridge. Here's Water Street, South Street, Cherry Street. Al Smith was born here. Well, there's some controversy about exactly where he was born. But he was born here. And then on Cherry Street was this notorious slum called Gotham Court, where over 400 people lived in these two tenements that stretched back from Cherry Street. And people argued that this was worse than the 5 Points. We were talking earlier, there was a 1870, 1880 medical study of this particular part of New York, and they estimated the infant mortality rate over two years in Gotham Court was 30%. So 30% of the children born in 2 years died because it was just a hellhole. It was a hellhole. Charles Dickens came and he visited both the 5 Points and Gotham Court, and he wrote Gotham Court was the worst slum he had seen in New York. And the idea is so that these men are the men who work the shore, and the cry would go out of longshoremen, and that's where the word longshoreman comes. And it was a tough life. It was day labor. Day labor. As when a ship came or a ship was departed, they needed a crew to load or unload that ship. And the men worked as day laborers. And it was dangerous if you're down in the hold here. And then there was the shape-up. And this is a prominent part of on the waterfront. So what would happen is a ship would come, and the longshoremen who were in the neighborhood, in the bars, would go and they'd stand and they'd hope to be picked for a day or 3 days labor. And that was a racket. The pier bosses shook the men down. And the mob controlled who went on what dock. And it was, and if you open your mouth, they would just simply kill you and throw the body in the river. And there was a time, I forgot the time period, 20, 30 years, there was never a conviction for a longshoreman who had been murdered and found in the river around the docks. It was an incredibly corrupt system. And the International Longshoremen's Association was hand and glove responsible for much of that. It was completely corrupt. And that's in the movie, if you've seen On the Waterfront. So there's a human story here as well. And this is the movie. And it wins the 6 Academy Awards. The director, Elie Kazan, is a famous film producer who, with a very, very complicated history during the Red Scare and the hearings in Washington. And it's set on the Hudson River, although it's filmed in Jersey City. And it's union corruption, gangsters, and violence. And then the figures in the movie, their names are all Irish. And Carl Malden plays Father Barry. And there was a Jesuit priest, John Corridon, who worked at Xavier High School on 19th Street. They had a labor institute. And he and another young Jesuits were influenced by the Catholic Workers Movement and the pontifical encyclicals on labor and the right of labor. And he's actually the source that Bud Schulberg uses when he writes the screenplay. And then it does lead to reform. In 1953, there's a Waterfront Commission formed, which takes over the labor and organizes the labor on the.
So the first round of Irish was pre-potato famine?
Pre-potato famine, through the potato famine, and there still were a lot of them working the docks into the early 20th century.
They also built Central Park.
They did.
Can you
Explain a shakedown.
Sorry?
Can you explain a shakedown?
Well, if if you got picked, you had to kick back some of your pay to the pier boss. If you didn't get picked, you'd go to the waterfront bar, and now you needed $5 to pay the rent that month. And the loan shark, the gangster loan shark, would lend you $5. You owed him $6.50 the following Friday. And if you didn't pay, you could be killed, or it was awful, really awful. Well, then there's another revolution, and it's the container. And I'll come back over here. This is Malcolm McLean. He was a shipping executive. He had a World War II surplus oil tanker which used to run from Houston to Newark, and he used to ship material back, and he said, I'm tired of being shook down. I'm tired of being robbed on the docks. He said, I'm going to build a metal container. I'm going to put my stuff to be shipped to Houston in this metal container, and I'm going to send that down to Houston. And this is another revolution. In the 1950s, it's estimated there were 50,000 longshoremen and maybe another 100,000 people working the docks. Drivers, all sorts of things. 2016, the commission publishes a report and estimates there are about 2,500 longshoremen. So in a heartbeat, a world disappears. And today, these container ships over in Port Newark and Elizabeth have 10,000 containers. And you can unload them in 15 or 24 hours, depending on how many cranes you can bring along. And this is a revolution. This is we're fighting now about world trade, right? Well, part of it is that the cost of transportation is practically zero. You can put some T-shirt on in a container in China, and then a month later it's for sale here in New York, and I can go in and buy myself a nice T-shirt for $1.25. All right. So this really is a revolution, and it just makes the Manhattan waterfront. It's not workable. Where are you going to get the trucks to move the containers off the piers on West Street or South Street or from the Brooklyn waterfront? It can't be done. So the Port Authority eventually takes over and moves the container port to Newark Bay, and that's where the big container ships go. There's a lonely couple of cranes over on the Brooklyn waterfront. I've never seen them used. Now they may, but they're there, and that was because of the political pressure. The Port Authority had to give some semblance of trying to maintain the Brooklyn waterfront. So the Port of New York moves to Newark Bay. And this is just I know this looks like I'm going to give you a quiz. This was a study the Port Authority did. Let's take a look at this ship. It had to unload 2,537 tons, and it took 4,268 labor hours of longshoremen. And that would take, in 98 containers, you could put 2,537 tons. And each lift, they call it a lift, would be $230. It just made that labor-intensive waterfront world redundant. The jobs just simply disappeared.
Isn't there another benefit out of that as well? Theft.
Containers aren't opened. And then, there's some sympathy for the longshoremen and the Longshoremen Union. When the containers start to come, their first demand is the longshoremen will unload the container, take whatever's out inside, put it back in, and then the container will leave the pier. But this was their livelihood. This is how they made their living. And then another piece to this is, you may know that the Panama Canal has been expanded. Mm-hmm. Well, these big container ships couldn't fit under the Bayonne Bridge, so the Port Authority added they raised the roadway, and now the largest container ships can come through the Panama Canal and get to Newark Bay. And I talked to some of the people at the Port Authority, and they thought now some of the big shipping companies will ship directly from China to Newark Bay and not ship to California, Long Beach, and then freight the material here to the east. The waterfront just disappears, and it's derelict. The piers fall down into the river. You can see how abandoned they are. I saw that Carol had some nice pictures over here on the wall where you get some sense of the decay. This is what the waterfront looked like. And this world, the piers now are empty and derelict, and the waterfront is empty and derelict. Well, this is also the near death of New York. I'm sure many of you were here. I was here in graduate school in the 70s, and Carol and I talked about this once, and God, you went to the East Village and you took your life in your hands. You walk down on the piers here with that elevated West Side Highway, and everything's dark. And crime, it was a terrifying place. And in the 70s, the city careened toward bankruptcy. And part of that was the collapse of the waterfront. Well, it doesn't happen, does it? We get this rebirth. Here's an example. A famous book about American cities was Jane Jacobs' classic Death and Life of Great American Cities, which he published in 1961. And if you went to graduate school in sociology, urban studies, this was on your syllabus. Well, she and her husband bought a house on Hudson Street, 1947, for $7,000. It sold in 2009 for $3.5 million. All right. White Horse Tavern, famous tavern on Hudson Street, used to be a Longshoreman hangout, a couple of blocks up from the Hudson River. Now it's all 20-somethings every day, right? And then the collapse of the waterfront gives the city the opportunity to rethink the waterfront. And that process begins. The Dinkins administration published a comprehensive waterfront plan, and that sort of sets in motion a whole series of events that are going to, in effect, save the waterfront. And Mayor Bloomberg follows that up with Vision 2020. And we have Hudson River Park. Now, for Hudson River Park to flourish, you had to fight the Battle of Westway. The idea to build a superhighway along the Hudson River would have been depressed, but that was, it looked like federal money was available, and a group of people in Greenwich Village and activists fought Westway, and eventually the plan was defeated. And so you have Hudson River Park, and then of course here we are in Battery Park City. And this is an example of the rebirth of the waterfront, isn't it? Now, the waterfront is a place for certainly well-to-do people to live and look out and see the waterfront. And then you have this beautiful waterfront park here that starts in Battery Park City. You go up the Hudson River, you eventually get to Riverside Park. You can go all the way up to the tip of the island. You can come around the lower Manhattan Island. You can walk all the way up to Stuyvesant Town and almost up to the UN. And the administration announced they're going to build now a connection to connect that right outside of the UN. So you can ride your bike up and then connect to the waterfront parks farther to the north. The High Line. The High Line has become one of the most popular tourist attractions in the city. Last time I walked, I was like this, 10,000 people. It was a rail line. The New York Central had this rail line, elevated railroad line that went down to their terminal. And the High Line then generates investment. Now, billions of dollars have been invested along the High Line. We can now walk from the Javits Center. We can walk down the High Line, get to Gonsworth Street. Here's the Whitney Museum. Then we can cross the street. Now we're on the Hudson River Park, and we can walk all the way down to where we are here today. And it's just a fabulous thing, isn't it? So what's very valuable now is the waterfront for its views and its openness and its connection to the rivers which surround Manhattan Island. And then there's gentrification. Now this is back to the human story. So what's possible to do is I picked an address on Bethune Street in the village. And this is the 1880 census data. You can see this on Ancestry.com. And you can see it's people from Arlen, 1900, Longshoremen, 1910, people from Arlen, 1920, laborers on the docks, 1930, again, a woman from Arlen. And Peter is a warehouse worker here on the docks. So here we can look at census data from 1880 to 1930. That's a long period of time. And Bethune Street was a working class street. The people who lived there worked the docks in one way or another. Well, the Zillow estimate is, as this happened a lot in the village. This was originally built as a single-family home. 1870s, 1880s, it's divided up into apartments. It remains that way until modern times. Someone buys that and turns it into a brownstone, which we can rent for 14. Well, there's a challenge here, and the challenge has to do with global warming. And Sandy was devastating, wasn't it? It was an unbelievable occurrence. The tide's rising, right? The harbor is filling, and then the wind shifts to the southwest and starts to push the water up further into the city. It floods. The Con Ed plant blows up over there on 14th Street. Southern part of the island doesn't have any electricity. Battery Park City, parts of it floods. And Mayor Bloomberg responds and says, well, maybe we'll spend $20 billion. We need to think this through. And here is a way of looking at this. This is that map we saw from the Revolutionary War period. And this is the city's current boundary. So here's Stuyvesant Town. That's the city planning has building models, and I put that there. Here's the Con Ed plant. Here's Battery Park City. And the light blue is the FEMA floodplain. So all of this made land. And what's striking, I think, is that the FEMA floodplain almost perfectly mirrors the 1609 waterfront of Manhattan. So all of that made land is vulnerable. All of it. And the question then is what do we do? Here's an example. We're back to these water lots we saw at the beginning. So I'm going to finish here. These are those water lots. Here they are today. And it's 14 buildings. The 14 buildings have 13.6 million square feet. And Maiden Lane, where one of my nephews worked, which flooded during Sandy, they've actually moved the mechanicals up to the 3rd floor. That's what they did. The building owner did that. But it's sold for $435 a square foot. So is this property, these 14 buildings, could be worth $6 billion, could be higher. That's a huge amount of investment. Look, FEMA's gone out to Long Island and down the Jersey Shore and said to a homeowner, we'll buy you out because you've been flooded 3 times. Well, that's not inexpensive to do, but there's no way the federal government is going to buy back these buildings. It's just not going to happen. So we're going to have to make our basements for buildings like this are going to have to be waterproof. Can you imagine the L line's going to be closed for a year? Because the tunnel flooded, and that tunnel needs to be replaced. And the Hudson River tunnel's flooded, and they need to be replaced, or at least, and this is just a huge expenditure that I think we're facing in this particular city. And I'll just end on a nicer note. So here's the waterfront, and this is in fact Battery Park City here, and this is up along the. It's really magnificent, isn't it? It really now is, what the value is the view. And that's not without controversy, because people who can afford it want to have their view. So along the Hudson River, you see the high-rises, don't you? Right? On Charles Street, I don't know if any of you know where Charles Street is, there's a condominium complex there. And they call this, there's a little street there called Charles Lane. That was called Pig Alley You know, that's where the drunks went to sleep off a bender. And now it's these apartments, you know, $20 million for the penthouse. Well, thank you. I hope I didn't take too much time.
I was investigating the buzz out there. So sorry. We're running a little bit late, but maybe 2 questions, and then we'll have a reception so you can ask questions individually.
Sure.
How did the waterfront affect the grid, the distance between the avenues?
It didn't, but what happens is all of the piers were at the end of a grid street. That's the way the grid tied into the waterfront, so that the access down to the pier, you had the street. So that's a piece to that. But certainly the waterfront begins before the grid. The grid is 1911. Gentlemen back.
I was a maritime reporter in the Journal of Commerce in the 90s. And one of the stories I remember, Malcolm claims one of the stories was I guess container information was coming in. It started in 56. I guess there was still some container ship that may have stopped on the west side. But Guinness had reported during the first year that containerization started, that pilferage would drop 1/3.
Yes. Yeah. And that was a huge part of crime on the waterfront, was the pilferage on the waterfront.
Sure.
And the container eliminates that, and also eliminates all those jobs. Maybe just one more question? Yes.
So the war years, World War II obviously had its effect on the docks. A lot must have been shipping there.
Yes.
How did they go about controlling that?
Well, let me quickly go back to World War I. In World War I, by 16, it's chaos on the docks, and the railroads are nationalized. And then a director is appointed, and he sorts that out. He sorts out. But the railroads boomed and the harbor boomed during the war. I mean, I think there were 50,000 people working 24/7.
And the Longshoremen's Union?
The Longshoremen's Union contributed because they knew they would have just continued work. So, well, thank you very much.
The shoreline of Manhattan, and one of the fascinating parts of the early part of Kurt's book is to talk about the water lots and the way that private enterprise began to extend the landfill of the island. And because, and I want to give a little promo for the museum and our upcoming exhibition in July called Skyline, in my research in looking into the kind of birth of the conception of the New York skyline, we've gone back into the early 19th century, but especially the last quarter of the 19th century, to look at the beginnings of the tallest buildings that give a silhouette against the sky, a kind of picturesque vantage. And increasingly, as I tried to press back the idea about how far you could identify a skyline in New York, one that wasn't of church spires, but rather of a secular skyline, I kept running up against these images of the piers and the ship masts and the verticals, which of course were a terminology. Skyscraper came out of the tall mast of the ships, or the highmost sail of the sailing ship. But the thing that really strikes me in the urban dimension, and this is from one of the souvenir books that we collected in the research for the exhibition, is that skyline and shoreline have so much to do with the complementary character and entrepreneurial energy of New York that shapes the city. And so it really is the kind of transference from the shoreline to the built fabric of the city that creates the new identity of New York, the vertical identity of New York that comes to characterize it as a brand around the world. And so this is just one of the lovely images that shows you the dominance of the shoreline, the multiplicity of the ship masts, and that one little produce exchange tower that you see in the very tip of lower Manhattan. And Broadway, and we'll get Fran Whedon to talk about it more next month. But tonight we're here to congratulate Kurt Schlichting on his brand new book, following the masterful Grand Central Engineer about William Wilbus and the creation of Grand Central Terminal, really the planning of modern Manhattan, as is the subtitle of this book. And this is the one that he already talked about 5 years ago. And this massive engineering project, but also master planning project, is enormously important in the urban development of the modern New York that we know today. That it seems only natural that the subject of the infrastructure, the highway of New York, which was its waterways, it became a next subject for his historical focus because this massive story that he's going to illustrate, I know from previewing some of his slides, of the connections between different parts of America and the world, all comes together in this really dominant force in New York's history. Of course, it's harbor, but throughout it's waterfront, and the changes that he recounts, but kind of organizes in this. This is the pre-pub version of it. There are the hard copies there, but in a small book with a just gigantic subject is a really extraordinary work of history. And I shouldn't say ironically, but surprisingly, because though Kurt is a historian, he actually is a professor of sociology at Fairfield College. As a matter of fact, he is the Fairfield University. He's the E. Gerald Corrigan Chair in the Humanities and Social Studies at Fairfield. So I guess he just dabbles in history, but he'll prove his stuff right now.